Okay, everyone, let's get started here. So this would be my first video and demonstration session for our research project. In phase one, we're going to have three different assignments. The first one is the descriptive statistics assignment, where you're asked to create some charts on a data set that I've provided to you. And then we will have two assignments in the inferential statistics section. The first one will be for confidence intervals, and then the second one will be for running a hypothesis test. And so these slides are the same slides that I use in our in-person class, but I'll be breaking it up into three different sessions. And so on this video, we're going to solely do the descriptive stats and create some charts in Excel. So the reason why I wanted to record this video is because I know in this class, we don't really teach a lot of the Excel fundamentals, or in the online setting, you don't necessarily get all the hands-on practice that we do in class. So many of you may not have used pivot tables before, or maybe created charts on your own. So I wanted to record this session so you can get watch me do it. This will be for a different data set, but a lot of the things that I will be doing in this video are going to be almost exactly what you would do for the assignment that's due this week. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, this video is solely going to be on descriptive stats, and we're going to be working through some charts in Excel. So I have three questions here, or tasks that I'm going to be working through in Excel. The first one is creating a column chart for neighborhood and number of listings. The second is create a column chart for neighborhood and average weekly price. And then the third one is going to be a two-parter. We're going to first create a pie chart for property type within the neighborhood Waverly for listings that have a weekly rate. And then we're going to kind of customize that look and do a donut chart. As I mentioned, this is going to be a different data set. So I'm going to be using one of the Airbnb data sets for Sydney, Australia. And so my business idea for Australia is to create a boat rental business. And so really what I want to be doing in this phase of the project is kind of analyzing the Airbnb market in Sydney to identify a good location to open my boat rental business. And so a part of the project that you'll see in the instructions as we progress into the semester is that you do need to supplement your research with something outside of the course materials, like the textbook. And so I'm going to pretend like I did some market research on the area of Sydney, Australia. And for this boat rental business, my feeling is my market for people traveling to Sydney would be that they would want to stay for a week, because we know that traveling to Australia can actually take a good amount of time. And so I'm going to target the weekly price in the Airbnb data. You can see that column here in column O, and I've highlighted some of the columns that I'm going to be using in this demonstration in red here. And so I'm going to be focusing on that. And in that market research, I did kind of identify that my demographic that's going to be using this boat rental business is probably willing to spend about $1,400 per week when they travel. So that's helpful for me because I might want to identify a location that would be suitable for that. We don't want to go have a rental place in a market that's going to be too expensive and the people wouldn't travel to. So that's kind of like setting the stage here for what I'm going to be doing with these charts. So I've identified 4 columns here: the ID column, the neighborhood cleanse column, and the property type that I'm going to be using in this demonstration today. So as I mentioned on the slides here, the first chart that I want to create is a column chart for each neighborhood that just simply shows the number of listings in that neighborhood. Now, to do these charts, you're really going to want to use pivot tables. So pivot tables are great for ad hoc analysis and summarizing data that we have in Excel. And so instead of you having to go through manually and count up the number of rows or Airbnb listings by neighborhood, we're going to use pivot tables to help us do that. And to create pivot table is actually quite simple in Excel. We're just going to click on Insert on the Insert ribbon here. And on the left-hand side here, you can see that there's a pivot table option. You want to make sure that your mouse, like your selection in the sheet, is somewhere on where the data is, because Excel will be smart and it will say, okay, you want to insert your pivot table from a table or range. Cool. So I'll click on that and you're going to get a little pop-up here, and it's going to automatically kind of detect where your data lives on this spreadsheet. So it detected that we have about 38,000 rows on this data set from A1 all the way down to AC 38081. And so I don't really ever change anything other than just making sure that it detected where your data is. You don't want to be creating your charts from a pivot table if it doesn't have all of your data. You don't really change this. I always just say put it on a new worksheet. So once I do this and everything looks good, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And that will create a new sheet on this workbook. And you can see that automatically the pivot table has been selected. Now you want to watch out, like if I click over here, then I'm not selected in the pivot table anymore, and you won't see the pivot table screen. You won't see the options up in the ribbon here for analyzing pivot table and designing it, and then as well as the pivot table fields. And so just watch out for that. Sometimes like people, I don't see the pivot table analyze button. Well, that's just because you're not clicked somewhere within the pivot table. So for this first question, my goal is I just want to see the number of listings by the neighborhood. So on the field section here, we have our filters, we have our columns. So that will put things in the pivot table running like, left to right. And then we have our rows that will put things in the pivot table going up and down. And then your values is where you're kind of summarizing data, whether it's a count of the listings, whether it's the average price, etc. You could do a sum of the number of reviews, etc. So this is going to be a relatively simple chart. I'm going to go ahead and drag the neighborhood cleansed down to my rows. So you can see that it actually adds all the neighborhoods there. And so the count of the rows is a little tricky and it might not feel as intuitive, but I'm actually just going to use the ID field. So I'm going to drag my ID field to the values. Now, you want to really watch out in pivot tables. So by default, you could see that it summarized that field using a sum. Well, that makes like no sense, right? So the sum of the ID, I'm getting these like really weird numbers here. And so that's just because the ID is a unique identifier for that Airbnb listing. And so I want to change that. So if I just click, so that's going to be left click. And I'm going to go to the value field settings, and I'm going to go ahead and change that to a count. So I want to just count up the IDs. Once I do that, I'm going to get a much more, realistic or understandable number. That this makes sense. Based on the 38,000 rows that we have, these numbers are looking more normal. So now, you can create charts without pivot tables. Don't get me wrong, but I think for this project, this makes it a lot easier because I didn't have to do all this stuff manually. You saw real quickly, just dragging and dropping, I built this. So the way I create charts from pivot tables is by using the option called pivot chart. So you could see it here. Just make sure you're within the pivot table. So you see when I click away, it goes away. So I'm going to click here and I have my pivot table analyze ribbon. I'm just going to go ahead and click on pivot chart. And so that will give you a little pop-up window and it'll ask you to pick all the charts. Now, keep in mind when you're working on this task, you do have to have your predetermined decision on what type of chart you want to create. And in the slide, you saw that I did say, I've already determined, I want to do a column chart. Column charts or bar charts, what columns are where the bars are going up and down, bars are where they're going left and right. This is going to be a common chart. So don't feel bad if you did a column chart and everybody else in the class also did the column chart, because depending on the data that you're working with, there's only going to be a handful of chart options that really make any logical sense. So that's normal. So I've determined that I want to do a column chart. So I'm going to go ahead and select clustered column. So you can see clustered column is when the bars are just kind of clustered together side by side. If I had more than one variable, you would have multiple bars per, but this is going to be a pretty simple one. So I'm just going to do a clustered column chart and click OK. And what that does is that creates my chart here. And right out of the gate, it doesn't look super good, right? So we got a little bit of cleanup that needs to be done here. This is just my personal style, but I'm not a huge fan of pivot charts with the different field buttons, like this neighborhood cleanse down here, count of ID. Granted, that might be helpful for some people, but I'm not a big fan of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the Pivot Chart Analyze button, and I'm going to turn those off. So right here under Field Buttons, there is a Hide All option. So I'm going to click on that, and that will just get rid of those fields. The other thing that I want to do here is I only have one thing. I'm just counting IDs for the neighborhood cleanse. So this blue legend called total is super not helpful. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that sucker, and I'm going to get rid of the legend. All right. So now we got a nice column chart, but there's two observations that I have here. Number one, the bars are kind of random. We could see that Sydney is the highest. That stands out to me pretty easily. But what would be nice is if these were sorted, right? So like that, it would be easier to see the areas of Sydney, Australia that have the most Airbnb listings. So in order to sort this is what's great about pivot tables and pivot charts, is this makes it really easy for me. So I could right click on my numbers here. I'm going to go to the sort option, and I'm going to say descending order, which is sort largest to smallest. So I do that, and all of a sudden now my chart's looking a lot cleaner, right? I could see that Sydney is the top, which makes sense because that's the area that we're working with. And then we have the second one, which is Waverly. I have, before this demonstration, predetermined that I am going to be working with Waverly in the third charts here. So we can see that here. But another thing that I see here is I don't really think do I really need to be showing all these other neighborhoods in Sydney, Australia that have very few Airbnb listings? I just don't know if that's relevant for me. So one, this is a really judgmental call for you when you're working on your charts, but I think to communicate my message to my audience, I think it's probably could be done easily with maybe just like the top 10 neighborhoods. It's going to make my chart a little bit cleaner, and it'll only have 10 bars. So once again, the reason why we're using pivot tables here is that also is quite easy to do with a pivot table. Now, I'm going to add a top filter to the neighborhood. And so I'm going to right click anywhere on this text, and there's a filter option, and it actually has by default a top 10. So hence that seems to be something common that people do. And so I'm going to click on the top 10. And since I want to show 10, I don't even need to change this window. So it's just show the top. You could change this number if you wanted to do 15 or 5 or whatever makes sense for you. And then you're filtering the items in the pivot table by the count of the ID. That's the only numerical measurement we have in our values. So I could just click on OK. And now I'm getting somewhere here. So now I have a really nice clean chart. And at this point, it's really up to customizing the aesthetics of my chart here. So it's very important when you're working in business that you don't just like submit a chart looking like this, because you will get a lot of questions from people. Like, what do the bars mean? What do the numbers mean? You mean they might be able to make sense of the labels here. The total in the chart title is not super helpful. So you want to be changing these or updating it to make it look a little bit nicer. So if you highlight this chart, there is a plus button here. Will allow you to add a couple of things. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to add two things. I'm going to add the axes titles, and then I'm also going to add data labels, and that's it. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this up, and I'm going to say neighborhood. This is the British version of neighborhood with the U. And then I'm going to change, and this is a little bit harder because it's running up and down, but we're going to say number of Airbnb listings. Then in my chart title, I'm just going to change this. I'm going to say top 10 Airbnb neighborhoods in Sydney, Australia. And there we go. Let's get rid of that. And so that is my completed chart for question number 1. just simply summarizing our Sydney, Australia listings data, showing the top 10 neighborhoods with the number of Airbnb listings. Let's go ahead and go back to our slides and say, okay, in step 2 here, I want to do a very similar chart than the one we just created. So it's going to be another column chart. But now what I want to be doing is I'm going to show for each neighborhood the average weekly price. So I mentioned for my boat rental business, I think people are going to be traveling to Sydney, Australia, and they're probably going to be staying more than a couple nights. So I'm going to focus in on my average weekly price because that will help me identify the neighborhoods that could be in my demographics, the amount that I think they could potentially afford when they're traveling. So you can copy and paste pivot tables, but for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and just create another one. So I'm going to click back on my data set here. I'm going to go back to the insert ribbon, and I'm going to select from table range, and I'm going to click OK. So for this particular chart, I'm going to not take as much time because I just kind of did a very detailed explanation of the first one. So since this chart is very similar to the one that we did before, I'm going to go ahead and drag my neighborhood cleanse to the rows. I'm going to scroll down into my pivot table fields here, and I'm going to find my weekly price. I'm going to drag that to my values. And so you could see I mentioned you got to watch out for pivot tables. It's not always going to pick the right way of summarizing your data at the first try. In this particular case, it summed up the weekly price, which doesn't make a ton of sense, just to sum up all of the Airbnb listings and add up their price. So I'm going to do a regular left click on my mouse, go to value field settings, and I'm going to change this to average. One thing that kind of stands out to me right away is I see some blanks. So Fairfield is blank. So if I go back to my data set, we can clearly see that not all Airbnb properties actually advertise a weekly price. So that's interesting information that I see right away. I'm going to go ahead and sort it just like I did before. And sorting it actually kind of solves that problem for me because it's going to move those neighborhoods. It's Liverpool and Fairfield. It's going to move it down to the bottom. And if I did like a top 10 chart on this one as well, then that would also just kind of weed those neighborhoods out. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to show you one thing that you can do. I'm going to go ahead and put the weekly price on the filters of this pivot table. And I'm going to click on the little drop down. And I'm going to select multiple items. And then I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom. And I'm just going to get rid of any listing that doesn't have a weekly price. So I click OK. I'm just going to uncheck the blanks on weekly price. And that actually gets rid of those two neighborhoods with no prices. So now I got my data set up for my chart here. And I'm just going to repeat what I did in the first chart. I'm just going to click on Pivot Table Analyze, click Pivot Chart, and select Clustered Column. And then there you go. And so I'm not going to do all of the cleanup on this one, like the axes titles, but you get the sense from the prior chart. All of your charts should have axes titles. They should have a chart title. It's optional to do the labels on the bars. We do have the height of the bar would be, crossing the y-axis here to tell us that. So the labels would be optional in my opinion, but axes titles and chart titles are not optional. I won't show the top 10 on this particular one again, but you could do a top 10 if you're working with, let's say, the daily price or in this case, the average weekly price. So here is a column chart for average weekly price by neighborhood sorted descending. And so in our last charts here, we're going to do a pie chart and a donut chart. So I am not a big fan of pie charts, but in certain situations, they can be effective if you're trying to show the composition of a whole. So like I'm kind of interested in knowing what types of properties I have. Now you can see that on the slide here, I've already identified Waverly. So let's take a look real quick again. So if I go back to our two charts that we created, I saw that Waverly was number 2. So that seems good. It's behind Sydney, but that makes a little sense here. So Waverly is the top 2 in the number of Airbnb listings. So that shows that there's a lot of places to stay, a lot of opportunities for people to travel to. Then if I go to my average weekly price chart, you'll see if we find Waverly here, Waverly it's about the top 8. But I notice here that the average weekly price is $13.46. And I mentioned that my market research indicated that that's right in our area of where our market might be willing to pay. So that's looking good to me. So I could do the combination, okay, Waverly is top 2, and also it's under my price point. In a later video, we're going to be doing inferential statistics with this same data set, and we're going to be doing a confidence interval estimate as well as a hypothesis test on this average weekly price. And so I'm going to stick with Waverly for my potential market for this boat rental business. So we're going to go ahead and create a pie chart here. If I go back to my slides, create a pie chart for property type within Waverly for listings that have a weekly rate. You saw me do that with the second chart. So we're going to go ahead and just start from scratch here, just so you guys can see it over and over again. And so I say create pivot table here. It's going to be very similar, but this time, this particular chart is looking at property type. So I'm going to go ahead and add property type to here. You can see that there's a lot of them, but I need to do a couple filters here. So I told you I want to focus on Waverly. So I'm going to go ahead and drag the neighborhood here, and I'm going to go down to Waverly. I don't need to check this select multiple items because I don't need to select multiple items. I actually just want to select the one, which is Waverly. And this time, the filter on the weekly price is important because I want to show the composition of the Waverly market by property type for only properties that have a weekly price. That on the average weekly price, it kind of weeded itself out with the descending, but this one time it's important. So I'm going to go ahead and check here and say select multiple items, and then go down to the bottom and get rid of any listings that don't have a weekly price. And so now we have our neighborhood here, and I want to just show the number of Airbnb properties. So I'm going to go ahead and use that count of ID again. I'm sorry, I'm going to drag that to the values and then change the summarize value field to a count. And so now we're seeing, okay, cool. I can kind of see the data here. It looks like apartments the most and house is the second. But what does it look like as a whole? So we're going to go ahead and click on here, and we're going to use a pie chart. So I'm going to click on pivot chart, and I'm going to find the pie chart option. And I'm going to click OK here. So I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the field buttons like I don't like. And so here's our pie chart. Now, this is where the legend is actually quite important, because the legend is going to tell us the pie slices, which property type for each pie slice. So we can see that apartment is definitely the vast majority of property types in Waverly. So if I click on the button here, I can actually add some data labels here, and it will add the count to the pie chart. And so pie charts don't need axes labels, but we definitely would want to do a chart type here. I'm not going to do it on the video call on this demonstration. I think you saw how I did that. You're just going to click on there and type what you would like to show. But what I'm really seeing with this particular chart is it's quite ugly. And the reason why it's ugly is because there are, several property types here that have very few listings, like bed and breakfast 1, bungalow 1, etc. And so you get these really small slices, and these are so not popular Airbnb listings that it just doesn't make the chart really good. So I'm thinking what I would like to do is I'm going to go ahead and wrap this demonstration up, and I'm actually going to show you how to create another chart actually just from the summarized data and not from a pivot chart. So if I go back to my slides here, I'm going to do a custom donut chart. So a donut chart is very similar to a pie chart, but the middle is cut out just like a donut, hence the name. And the reason why donut charts can be favorable over pie charts is it takes away the measurement of angles in each of the slices. So the human eye sometimes can have a hard time measuring how big an angle is. And so sometimes the theory is a donut chart can help with that. And what I want to do though is this is gonna be a custom donut chart. We're not gonna be using the pivot table. And I'm gonna create a donut chart by apartment, house, condo / townhouse, and then other. So we'll go ahead and go back to Excel, and I'm going to do this on this page. I'm not going to do another sheet. And so I'm going to just start typing here. So we're going to say apartment. And I can see that I have 429 apartments. The second option is house, and that is 116. And then the third option, I decided that condos and townhomes or townhouses are similar. So I'm going to go ahead and group those together. If you notice, I'm just double clicking here to make that bigger. So condos is 8, townhouses are 9. So I'm listening, instead of doing that math in my head, I'm actually just going to say equals 8 plus 9. Now I'm really simplifying things for this video, not like trying to reference the cells in the pivot table. Just going to go ahead and type the numbers to keep it simple. And so there's 17 condos and townhouses. And then the rest of them is just going to go into like a catch-all category called other. And so we know that there's 578 total. So I'm going to go ahead and use my math skills in Excel here. I'm just going to say 578 minus the sum of these other three. So I'm going to add those three up, and then I'm just going to subtract it from 578. So that's what's left in the other bucket. So there are 16 Airbnb listings that are not these three. And so now I got my data set up here. So I'm going to go ahead and just highlight it here. And so when you're creating a chart just from a range of cells in Excel, you will go to your insert ribbon. And I'm going to go into the middle section here for charts. And I'm going to click on the down arrow, and I'm going to select donut chart. So here you can see we have it side by side here. We can see that our donut chart definitely is looking a lot better. So we got our apartments, we got our houses, our condo townhomes, and then other. I'm going to customize this. We'll wrap it up. We don't need to, but what I would like to do is I want to show you how to customize your data labels on a pie or donut chart. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the plus, and I'm going to select data labels. So that would add just those counts to the labels, and that looks pretty good here. But I'm going to right click on them. I'm going to do that again. Make sure that when you click on it like that all of them are selected. Sometimes if I do this, then only that one is selected. So watch out for that. I want to actually change the data labels for all of them. I'm going to say format data labels. That was a right click that I just did. And I'm going to go ahead and add the percentages. But I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the value. So I just want to show just the percentages of the total. So this is a pie chart and a donut chart are really only used when you're trying to show the composition of a whole. And so now I have a nice chart here that's showing that apartments are 74% of the market in Waverly with weekly Airbnb listings. So later in the semester, I'm going to be doing a hypothesis test video, and we'll be using this data for one of the hypothesis tests for a proportion. So that really does wrap up this demonstration of creating some charts for descriptive statistics for Sydney, Australia. I hope this helps you out as you work on your first assignment for the Montreal, Canada data. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.